sometimes the greatest love story begins with the one person you stopped noticing because they had always been there. At exactly 12:47 on a quiet Wednesday night, Caleb Foster lay awake in the top bunk of the small university dorm room he had shared with Mason Reed for nearly 2 years. Outside, a gentle spring rain tapped against the window while the campus slowly disappeared beneath pools of golden light. The semester had reached its busiest weeks, and unfinished architecture sketches covered Caleb's desk below like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Mason had fallen asleep almost an hour earlier after finishing another digital media project, one arm hanging over the side of his bed as soft music continued playing through a small speaker near the window. The room was ordinary in every possible way. 2 narrow beds stood only 8 feet apart. 2 desks overflowed with textbooks, coffee mugs, headphones, and memories collected through late-night study sessions, shared meals, and countless conversations that somehow made college feel less overwhelming. Earlier that evening, several classmates had insisted Caleb should finally try a dating application instead of spending every weekend buried in blueprints. Curious but unconvinced, he downloaded one after returning from the architecture studio, promising himself he would probably delete it before morning. He leaned against the wall, scrolling through unfamiliar faces with polite indifference. Nothing caught his attention. Then the next profile appeared, and the world around him seemed to stop moving. The smiling face on the screen belonged to Mason. The photograph had been taken during last year's campus festival, and Caleb recognized it immediately because he had been the one standing behind the camera. The profile described someone who loved old movies, sunrise walks, coffee after midnight, and meaningful conversations more than crowded parties. Caleb looked slowly from the glowing screen toward the bed beneath him where Mason continued sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that his face had just appeared inside a dating application only 8 feet away. Caleb whispered to himself that this had to be some strange coincidence. Maybe the application had made a mistake. Maybe someone had copied Mason's pictures. Yet every detail matched perfectly. His pulse quickened as he stared at the screen for another long moment. Nervousness made his hands unsteady, and as he adjusted his grip, his thumb accidentally brushed across the display. Before he could react, bright colors filled the screen with cheerful animation. A message appeared in large letters. It was a match. Caleb froze. The application only displayed that message if both people had already chosen each other. That meant Mason had pressed the like button first, sometime before this very moment. Caleb slowly lowered the phone and looked once more at the quiet figure sleeping below. Rain continued falling outside, the music played softly in the background, and nothing inside the room appeared different. Yet everything had changed. For the first time since moving into that dormitory, Caleb realized the greatest mystery was not why he had found Mason's profile. It was why Mason had been quietly hoping Caleb would find it at all. Morning arrived much sooner than Caleb Foster wanted. Long before his alarm sounded, he was already awake, staring at the ceiling while replaying the impossible notification from the previous night. He reached quietly for his phone, almost hoping it had all been a dream created by exhaustion after another week of architecture projects. It was still there. The match remained exactly where he had left it. The application had not changed its mind. Neither, apparently, had Mason Reed. Caleb slowly climbed down from the top bunk, careful not to wake his roommate. As soon as his feet touched the floor, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "You are awake early." Caleb turned to see Mason sitting up in bed, his blonde hair still untidy from sleep. He smiled with the relaxed expression Caleb had seen almost every morning since they first became roommates. Nothing about his face suggested panic or embarrassment. If anything, he looked unusually calm. "Big review today," Caleb answered while forcing a casual smile. "I wanted a little extra time." Mason nodded before walking toward the small coffee maker sitting between their desks. Preparing coffee had quietly become his morning routine almost 2 years earlier, and somehow he always remembered exactly how Caleb preferred it. Without asking a single question, Mason poured the stronger blend into the familiar blue mug and placed it beside Caleb's sketchbook. "You always think better after the first cup," he said. Caleb thanked him softly, suddenly realizing how many small details Mason had been remembering all this time. Both of their phones rested face down on separate desks. Normally Mason checked every notification before finishing his coffee, especially messages from classmates working on media projects. This morning he never touched his phone. Caleb noticed immediately. Mason noticed Caleb noticing. Neither of them said anything. The silence stretching across the tiny dorm room felt strangely heavier than any difficult conversation they had ever shared. Rain clouds drifted away, allowing warm sunlight to spill through the window, but the familiar room no longer felt quite the same. As they gathered backpacks and books before leaving for class, Mason finally broke the silence with a lighthearted smile. Technology creates some unexpected surprises sometimes. Caleb looked toward him, uncertain whether those words referred to the weather application, social media, or something much more personal. Before he could ask, Mason simply adjusted the strap of his backpack and opened the dorm room door. They crossed campus together exactly as they always did, discussing professors, homework deadlines, and the upcoming baseball game scheduled for the weekend. Every sentence sounded perfectly ordinary, yet beneath each conversation rested another one neither had the courage to begin. When they reached the intersection where the architecture building stood opposite the communications department, Mason stopped walking. He looked at Caleb for a brief moment before speaking again. "Whatever happened last night," he said quietly, "I hope it does not make today awkward." Caleb searched his roommate's expression, trying to decide whether Mason was inviting honesty or protecting both of them from it. Before Caleb could answer, Mason smiled warmly, gave a small wave, and disappeared through the glass doors of his building, leaving Caleb standing alone beneath the bright morning sky with one impossible realization growing clearer every minute. The match itself was no longer the mystery. The real question was why Mason sounded almost relieved that it had finally happened. The rest of Thursday passed in a blur of lectures, presentations, and unfinished thoughts that refused to leave Caleb Foster alone. Every professor's voice seemed distant, every blueprint on his drafting table appeared slightly out of focus, and every quiet moment allowed the memory of the unexpected match to return. By the time the final class ended, the afternoon sun had already begun sinking behind the university library, painting long shadows across the campus sidewalks. Caleb made his way back to the dorm carrying a portfolio filled with architectural drawings, hoping familiar routines might quiet the growing questions inside his mind. Instead, he found Mason Reid already sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by camera lenses, notebooks, and editing equipment for another digital media assignment. Mason looked up with his usual relaxed smile. "Perfect timing," he said. "I was starting to think the architecture department had officially adopted you." Caleb laughed softly as he placed his portfolio beside the desk. "It almost did today." For nearly an hour, everything felt comfortingly familiar. Mason edited video clips while quietly humming along with background music. Caleb adjusted building elevations and reviewed structural notes. Occasionally one of them asked the other a simple question about homework, and the answers came naturally, just as they always had. Yet beneath the comfortable routine, both of them remained unusually aware of every glance, every pause, and every moment of silence. Caleb noticed Mason pushing his sleeves up whenever he concentrated, tapping a pencil against the desk whenever an idea refused to come together, and smiling to himself whenever he solved a difficult editing problem. Those habits had existed for years. Somehow, they suddenly felt brand new. As evening settled outside the dormitory windows, Mason closed his laptop and stretched his arms before looking directly at Caleb. "I think we should settle something," he said with a grin that tried to sound playful but carried unmistakable nervousness beneath it. Caleb slowly looked up. "What do you have in mind?" Mason leaned comfortably against the side of his bed. "The match." The room immediately became quiet. Caleb waited without speaking. Mason rubbed the back of his neck before continuing. Pretending nothing happened is somehow making everything more awkward. Caleb nodded in agreement. I have been thinking the same thing. Relief crossed Mason's face. Good. Then I have an idea. He pointed toward the small campus cafe visible across the courtyard through the dormitory window. Tomorrow evening we go there together. Caleb raised an eyebrow. Mason laughed softly. Call it a completely fake date. We drink coffee, talk for an hour, prove the application created one very strange misunderstanding, then come home and continue being the same roommates we have always been. Caleb studied Mason's expression carefully. The words sounded light-hearted, yet his eyes quietly searched for an answer that mattered far more than the joke itself. After several thoughtful seconds, Caleb smiled. I will agree under one condition. Mason folded his arms with exaggerated seriousness. Name it. Caleb took a slow breath before answering. For the entire evening, neither of us is allowed to lie about anything. Mason's smile gradually softened into something calmer and more sincere. He held Caleb's gaze for several long seconds before quietly nodding. That sounds fair. Neither of them realized that one simple rule would transform a harmless experiment into the most honest conversation either of them had ever shared. Friday evening arrived wrapped in the soft golden light of early spring, and the university campus seemed unusually peaceful as Caleb Foster walked beside Mason Reed toward the small cafe near the center of campus. Students gathered on the lawn with textbooks and guitars while others hurried toward evening classes, completely unaware that two roommates were quietly carrying the weight of a conversation neither of them had ever imagined having. Mason reached the cafe door first and held it open with an exaggerated smile. Since this is apparently our completely fake date, he said with playful confidence, I should at least pretend to have good manners. Caleb laughed despite the nervousness resting inside him. You are taking this role very seriously. Mason shrugged with a grin. I have always believed in committing to a joke. The familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm cinnamon pastries greeted them as they stepped inside. Instead of choosing the usual table where they often studied together after lectures, Mason guided them toward a quiet corner where the evening crowd faded into a gentle background of conversations and soft music. They ordered exactly what they always ordered. Caleb chose his favorite caramel latte while Mason stayed loyal to plain black coffee. For several moments they simply looked at one another, both remembering the single rule that had brought them there. No lying. Mason rested both hands around his coffee cup before speaking first. I will start with something easy, he said. I downloaded the dating application because my cousins insisted I spent too much time studying and not enough time meeting people. Caleb smiled. My classmates told me almost the same thing. They laughed together, and the nervous tension slowly began to disappear. The conversation drifted naturally toward memories they had somehow never shared despite living together for nearly 2 years. Mason admitted that people usually expected him to be the funny, outgoing person in every room, but very few ever asked how he was actually feeling. Caleb quietly confessed that designing buildings had always been easier than explaining emotions because blueprints followed rules while people rarely did. Mason listened without interrupting, then smiled with quiet understanding. That explains why you always care through actions instead of words. Caleb looked surprised. What do you mean? Mason leaned forward slightly. You never tell people they matter to you. You repair things before they notice they are broken. You remember every presentation date. You bring coffee during long studio nights without being asked. You always leave the desk lamp on whenever you know I will come back late. Caleb lowered his eyes, suddenly realizing those small habits had never gone unnoticed. I thought you never paid attention. Mason smiled warmly. Caleb, we have shared one room for almost 2 years. I notice far more than you think. As daylight slowly faded beyond the cafe windows, their conversation continued through childhood memories, family traditions, future dreams, and quiet fears they had never trusted anyone else enough to share. When they finally stepped back outside beneath the glowing campus lights, neither of them hurried toward the dormitory. The evening had begun as an attempt to prove one unexpected match meant nothing, yet with every honest word they exchanged, both of them quietly realized the most important connection between them had never started with an application at all. It had been growing unnoticed through countless ordinary days long before either of them found the courage to see it. The weekend arrived carrying a quiet sense of hope that neither Caleb Foster nor Mason Reed knew how to describe. Their evening at the campus cafe had ended without dramatic confessions, yet something inside their shared dorm room had undeniably changed. The room looked exactly the same as it always had. Two beds remained only 8 feet apart. Their desks were still covered with books, headphones, coffee mugs, and unfinished assignments. Even the small coffee maker hummed with the familiar rhythm of another morning. Yet every ordinary detail now seemed to carry a deeper meaning. Caleb found himself noticing how naturally Mason always placed the stronger coffee beside his architecture sketches before preparing his own cup. Mason quietly noticed that Caleb always adjusted the room temperature before bedtime because he knew Mason slept better when the room felt slightly cooler. None of those habits had appeared overnight. They had simply gone unnoticed until honesty gave them new meaning. Late Saturday afternoon, Caleb walked across campus to print presentation boards for an upcoming design review. When he returned an hour later, Mason had stepped out to help classmates finish a media project. The dorm felt strangely empty without the easy conversation that usually filled the space. Almost absent-mindedly, Caleb unlocked the dating application for the first time since their unexpected match. Their message history remained completely blank except for the automatic notification announcing they had connected. Curious, Caleb opened Mason's profile once more and slowly reread every sentence. One line immediately caught his attention. "Looking for someone who already feels like home before either of us realizes it." Caleb quietly repeated those words to himself. Images from the past 2 years flowed through his mind. Mason waiting outside the architecture studio with coffee during final exams. Mason staying awake until Caleb finished difficult projects because he refused to let his roommate walk back to the dorm alone after midnight. Mason remembering birthdays, favorite snacks, and tiny details Caleb himself often forgot. Before Caleb could gather his thoughts, the dormitory door opened. Mason stepped inside carrying his backpack with an expression Caleb could not quite read. "You are back earlier than I expected," Caleb said. Mason smiled politely while placing his keys on the desk. Group meeting ended sooner than planned. After a brief pause, Mason spoke again. Something unexpected happened afterward. Caleb looked up from his phone. Mason rested against the side of his bed before continuing. "A journalism student named Logan Hayes asked whether I wanted to have coffee with him next week." Caleb forced a calm smile that felt far more difficult than he expected. "He sounds confident." Mason nodded slowly. "He seems like a genuinely kind person." The room fell quiet for several moments before Mason asked softly, "Do you think I should go?" Caleb remembered the promise they had made only one evening earlier. No lying. His heart wanted to ask Mason not to go anywhere. His fear answered first instead. "I think you should give him a chance," Caleb said gently. Mason studied his face for a long moment, searching for something that never appeared. Finally, he offered a small smile that failed to reach his eyes. "All right," he replied quietly. As Mason turned away to unpack his backpack, Caleb realized with painful clarity that the very first promise they had made during their fake date had already been broken, because the one answer he wanted to give was the only answer he had been too afraid to say aloud. Monday afternoon arrived beneath a clear blue sky, but Caleb Foster could not appreciate the beautiful weather no matter how hard he tried. Ever since telling Mason Reed that he should give Logan Hayes a chance, an uncomfortable silence had settled inside him. He buried himself in architectural drawings, convinced that enough work could drown out emotions he refused to admit. It did not. Every empty space on the blueprint somehow reminded him of the empty feeling growing inside his own heart. After his final class ended, Caleb returned to the dorm expecting to find Mason editing another video project. Instead, the room was empty except for a handwritten note resting beside the coffee maker. Meeting Logan for coffee. Save me some if you are still awake. Caleb stared at the note longer than he should have before carefully placing it back exactly where he had found it. He reminded himself that this was the future he had encouraged. Mason was simply following the advice Caleb himself had given. Even so, the familiar dorm room suddenly felt much larger than before. The silence echoed through every corner. Determined not to dwell on it, Caleb carried his laptop to the architecture studio and spent the next 2 hours revising a museum design that refused to satisfy him. Every line seemed slightly crooked. Every decision felt uncertain. When he finally returned after sunset, he quietly unlocked the dorm room door and stopped in surprise. Mason was already home. His jacket still rested across the back of his chair, his backpack remained unopened, and a cup of coffee sat untouched beside him. He was not editing videos. He was simply staring through the window at the lights scattered across campus. Mason looked up and offered a gentle smile. "You are back." Caleb nodded. "How was your evening?" Mason let out a quiet breath before answering. "Short." Caleb placed his backpack beside the desk. "Everything all right?" Mason gave a thoughtful shrug. "Logan is exactly the kind of person most people would hope to meet. He is kind, intelligent, respectful, and easy to talk to." Caleb forced himself to smile. "That sounds like a good date." Mason looked down at the untouched coffee before softly shaking his head. "It should have been." The room became still. After a long pause, Mason finally continued. "Halfway through the conversation, Logan asked me what kind of person usually makes me feel comfortable." Caleb listened without interrupting. Mason smiled sadly. "I realized every answer I gave described someone else." Caleb felt his heartbeat quicken, but he remained silent. Mason slowly lifted his eyes and met Caleb's gaze. "Someone who remembers how I take my coffee without asking. Someone who waits until I get back before turning off the desk lamp. Someone who notices when I pretend everything is fine." Caleb could barely breathe. Mason spoke one final sentence, quietly and honestly. "Logan was a wonderful person, but he was not you." The words settled gently between them, carrying more truth than either of them had been brave enough to speak until now. Caleb wanted to answer immediately, yet fear still wrapped itself around every word waiting inside his heart, and that silence became the only reply Mason believed he was ever going to receive. The silence that followed stayed with both of them long after the conversation ended. Caleb Foster lay awake that night staring at the ceiling above his bed, hearing every quiet sound inside the familiar dorm room. Mason Reed had already turned off his bedside lamp, but neither of them was truly asleep. The words, "He was not you," continued echoing inside Caleb's mind, followed immediately by the answer he had been too frightened to give. He understood exactly what his silence must have sounded like. To Mason, it had probably felt like rejection. To Caleb, it had simply been fear disguised as hesitation. Morning arrived with its usual routine, yet everything felt strangely fragile. Mason still prepared coffee before class. Caleb still thanked him. They still walked across campus together, but the easy conversations that normally filled the sidewalks had disappeared. Instead, they spoke only about assignments, deadlines, and upcoming presentations. Even their classmates noticed the change. During an afternoon studio session, Caleb's academic advisor stopped beside his drafting table and mentioned that a private single dorm room had unexpectedly become available for the final semester because another student had transferred. "You have always worked well on your own," the professor said. "If you want more space for your architecture projects, you should apply before someone else does." Caleb politely accepted the application form without thinking very much about it. Later that evening, after returning to the dorm, he placed the folded paper inside one of his sketchbooks. He told himself the decision had nothing to do with Mason. A private room would mean more space, fewer distractions, and quieter nights before graduation. Yet deep inside, he knew another reason had quietly guided his hand. If Mason truly believed Caleb did not share his feelings, perhaps creating distance would make moving forward easier for both of them. Caleb convinced himself that leaving now might preserve the friendship they had spent 2 years building. Over the next several days, he completed the housing application between architecture assignments, carefully hiding it beneath stacks of blueprints whenever Mason entered the room. He never mentioned it. Unfortunately, secrets rarely remained hidden for long inside a university dormitory. On Friday afternoon, Mason stopped by the housing office to ask about maintenance requests for their building. While waiting at the front desk, one of the residents' assistants smiled and casually asked whether he was excited about Caleb's upcoming room transfer. Mason blinked in confusion. Room transfer? The assistant immediately realized the mistake and apologized, but the damage had already been done. Mason thanked her politely before walking back across campus with slow, uncertain steps. When he quietly opened the dorm room door later that evening, Caleb was sitting at his desk reviewing structural drawings. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Mason noticed the familiar application form resting beneath the edge of Caleb's sketchbook. He did not need to read a single word to understand what it meant. His voice remained calm, but the disappointment inside it was impossible to miss. You were planning to leave without telling me. Caleb slowly stood, searching for the right explanation. Before he could speak, Mason looked directly into his eyes and asked the one question Caleb had been hoping never to hear. Are you moving because you do not feel the same way, or because you are afraid that you do? Caleb Foster looked at Mason Reed for what felt like the longest moment of his life, yet every second of silence only deepened the misunderstanding growing between them. The folded housing application remained on the desk like a decision that had already been made. Mason slowly looked away, giving a quiet nod that carried more disappointment than anger. You do not have to explain anything, he said softly. I already understand. Caleb immediately shook his head. No, you do not. His voice stopped Mason before he could reach the door. The room became completely still except for the faint sound of rain beginning to fall against the dormitory window, almost echoing the same gentle rhythm from the night everything had started. Caleb walked toward his desk and opened the bottom drawer where an old sketchbook rested beneath several architecture magazines. From inside its pages he carefully removed a folded letter, its edges slightly worn from being opened and closed countless times without ever being delivered. He handed it to Mason with trembling hands. I wrote this almost 3 months ago, Caleb admitted quietly. Long before the dating application. Long before the match. Mason unfolded the paper and began reading. The letter was not dramatic. It did not contain perfect speeches or impossible promises. Instead, it described ordinary moments that had quietly become extraordinary. It spoke about late-night coffee left beside blueprints, about finding comfort simply hearing another person typing across the room. While studying, about never feeling alone because someone was always only 8 feet away. Near the bottom, one sentence made Mason stop reading altogether. I think I started falling in love with my roommate so gradually that I never noticed the exact day it happened. Mason slowly lowered the letter, his eyes shining with quiet emotion. Why did you never give this to me? Caleb smiled sadly. Because I believed losing you would hurt more than never telling you the truth. Mason reached into his own backpack and unlocked his phone before placing it gently into Caleb's hands. The dating application remained open. Caleb immediately noticed the date beneath his own profile. Mason had pressed the like button exactly 1 week before Caleb ever downloaded the application. Mason laughed softly through the emotion in his voice. The match was never an accident from my side. I recognized your profile immediately and hoped you would eventually see mine. Caleb stared at the screen before looking back at Mason. You waited an entire week? Mason nodded. Every day I almost deleted the application because I thought you would never join. They stood quietly facing one another while years of unspoken feelings finally made perfect sense. Caleb walked back to the desk, picked up the housing application, looked at it one final time, and slowly tore it into two pieces before placing it into the recycling bin beside his chair. He turned back toward Mason with the first completely unguarded smile either of them had seen in months. I am staying, he said. Mason tilted his head slightly. Because you feel sorry for me? Caleb stepped closer and gently shook his head. No. I am staying because home has never been this room. Home has always been the person waiting for me inside it. For the first time since that impossible notification appeared on a glowing screen, neither of them needed courage to speak because the truth had finally become simpler than fear. 3 months later, the university campus welcomed the first warm days of spring, and Caleb Foster stood quietly on the rooftop terrace of the student center while the evening sun painted the skyline with soft shades of gold and blue. Graduation was only a few weeks away, and students gathered across the lawns below, celebrating completed projects, future careers, and friendships that had carried them through college. Beside Caleb, Mason Reid rested comfortably against the railing with 2 familiar coffee cups balanced carefully in his hands. Some routines, they had both learned, were worth keeping forever. Very little inside their dorm room had actually changed during those 3 months. The same 2 beds still stood 8 feet apart. Their desks remained crowded with architecture models, camera equipment, notebooks, and unfinished ideas waiting for one last semester to end. Mason still prepared coffee before Caleb woke each morning. Caleb still left the desk lamp glowing whenever Mason stayed late editing a project. The difference was no longer found in the room itself. It lived inside the quiet certainty neither of them felt the need to hide anymore. They no longer searched every conversation for the perfect moment to say how they felt because ordinary moments had become more meaningful than dramatic words ever could. After presenting his final architecture portfolio that afternoon, Caleb had walked out of the auditorium to find Mason already waiting exactly where he always waited after important presentations, leaning casually against a nearby tree with an encouraging smile and 2 cups of coffee. No announcement had been necessary. No grand gesture had been expected. Showing up had quietly become their favorite way of saying everything that mattered. As the evening breeze drifted across the rooftop, Mason reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone before laughing softly. I almost forgot something. Caleb smiled with curiosity. Mason opened the dating application that had unexpectedly changed both of their lives and handed the phone over. I think this finally finished its job. Caleb unlocked his own phone and opened the same application. They exchanged amused glances before counting together. 1, 2, 3. Both pressed the delete button at exactly the same moment. The colorful icon disappeared from both screens, leaving only quiet satisfaction behind. Mason slipped his phone back into his pocket and looked toward the campus below. Funny, he said. The application introduced us after we had already lived together for almost 2 years. Caleb smiled warmly. It never introduced us. Mason looked over with raised eyebrows. Caleb continued softly. It only forced us to notice what had been right in front of us the entire time. They stood together without speaking as the last sunlight disappeared beyond the university buildings. New students were carrying boxes into residence halls while graduating seniors prepared to leave for futures none of them could fully imagine. Caleb realized that thousands of stories were beginning and ending all around them at that very moment. Some would begin with chance encounters. Others would begin with unexpected conversations. Theirs had started only 8 feet apart inside a small dorm room where 2 ordinary roommates had mistaken familiar comfort for simple friendship until one impossible notification revealed the truth they had both been quietly protecting. Sometimes love does not arrive from far away. Sometimes it waits patiently across a room, remembers exactly how you take your coffee, leaves the light on when you are working late, and hopes that one ordinary day you will finally look up and realize that home has been waiting beside you all along.